My name is Karen Lee. I work with cities around the world today on issues of healthy built environments. So thinking about our buildings, our streets, our neighborhoods, and how we integrate, I think, strategies in that will also promote health in everyday life. So today, I'm going to be talking about some of the issues around health in the built environment. I'll also give a very quick overview of the active design guidelines that was mentioned. And Sky will then talk about aligning city planning and transportation policies and practices with the work that can promote health. I want to start with a little bit of public health history to learn some of the lessons around what can work, what can't work. And if we look at the 19th century and the early 20th century, in many of our cities, actually, the leading causes of death were infectious diseases. Diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, yellow fever were epidemic. And the way that we actually conquered these diseases was we used 19th century codes, planning, and city infrastructure as the weapons against these diseases. So the sanitation movement, as an example, actually helped to conquer those diseases. And we took those strategies and we built them into our city's fabrics. Every part of our city, our buildings, our streets, our neighborhoods, their amenities, and they were effective. Today, we live in a different century. Many of these diseases are now conquered, the infectious ones, but we now have a new set of diseases, chronic diseases, also called non-communicable diseases. So these are not infectious in nature. The diseases like heart disease and strokes, cancers, diabetes. And actually, we can think of many of these diseases as diseases of energy because two key risk factors to these diseases are actually physical inactivity and unhealthy diets. When we consume too many calories, we're actually consuming too much unhealthy energy. When we don't move our bodies in the form of activity in daily life, we actually usually have to consume some external energy source, right? Like petrochemical fuels in cars, elevators and escalators in the form of electricity. If our children aren't playing, they're usually playing video games or sitting in front of the television, which also consumes electricity and some external source of energy. And because of this energy equation, there's actually a lot of overlaps between the design solutions for health today and the design solutions for environmental sustainability. So there are actually multiple benefits to design in this way. So going back in history, if you look at 100 plus years ago, so this is a slide of the conditions in New York, but they actually aren't so different from many of our cities in their early beginnings. So in certain parts of the city, like Lower Manhattan, there was severe overcrowding. And the conditions of the buildings were such that they didn't have any light and air, right? There were no windows, for example, in the tenements. So the densities in 1910 were approximately double in average of what they are in Manhattan today. And in some of the wards, they actually reached over 400,000 people per square mile. So that's like 6 to 7 times what Manhattan is today. So even though density, a sufficient density is actually something that we have to strive for today, overpopulation and overcrowding is not something that we want. The other, of course, you couple this with inadequate systems for garbage, water, and sewer, leading to pervasive filth and water supplies. So basically, if you look at some of the history books about Manhattan, they will describe the drinking water as coming from a pond downtown. And that pond often had dead animals floating in it, or garbage would flow from the streets into it. And so, if you look at the tenement buildings, they were extremely crowded, no windows, so no light and air. The streets were such that the buildings were set very, very closely together, so light and air actually couldn't enter those streets. So they were always dark and dank. There would be puddles, mosquitoes would breed. And so what epidemics did you see? You saw diseases spread by crowding and lack of ventilation, like tuberculosis. You saw waterborne diseases like cholera. You saw mosquito-borne diseases like yellow fever. So the response, actually, from the city was one that was using design, planning, and policy. In 1842, after multiple cholera epidemics, the city said, I think we need to move our water drinking supply from that downtown pond to a new water supply, the Croton Aqueduct in upstate New York. And that remains today New York City's drinking water source. And overnight, those cholera epidemics went away, and they never came back. 1857, Central Park was created, hailed as ventilation for the working man's lungs. So now, whether you are wealthy and have your own courtyard, or you lived in a tenement and you didn't have your own courtyard, you could take your family to this great public space for light and air and exercise. 1881, the Department of Sanitation was created and started cleaning the city streets of, all of the garbage and horse manure that had piled up for years. 1901, the Tenement House Act was passed and banned the construction of dark, airless tenement buildings. So now, all of a sudden, every home had to have windows, and light and air could now circulate, and there was ventilation. 1904, the first section of the subway opens in large part to deal with that severe overcrowding in lower Manhattan, so people could now spread out, live in upper Manhattan and the Bronx, and yet travel down quickly to the areas of commerce and work. And zoning was used by New York City in 1916 to set the buildings back so that now sunlight and fresh air could enter. Those puddles dried up, those mosquitoes that were spreading yellow fever went away. So what did we see? The results of all of this work was that in 1880, leading causes of death, infectious diseases, about 60% of deaths. By 1940, prior to the widespread use of antibiotics, because penicillin, the first antibiotic, not discovered until 1939. Antibiotics were not in widespread use in 1940. But by 1940, infectious disease deaths had dropped to 11% of deaths. And you can see between 1940 and 2011, that's, of course, when all of our medical technologies were progressing very rapidly. We've made continued gains in infectious diseases at mortality. But the major gains were made really in the sanitation era when we actually fundamentally changed our environments and the environmental conditions that produced these diseases. So that is to say that as important as it is to treat diseases once people are ill, it is actually more important in societies to prevent them in the first place, and to prevent them by looking at the environmental conditions that are actually causing and propagating the epidemics. So today, the epidemics are a different set of diseases and conditions. They are conditions like obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and strokes, and cancers. In fact, chronic diseases globally have overtaken infectious diseases as the leading cause of death. Even in the developing world, heart disease and strokes have now overtaken infectious diseases as the leading cause of death. 36 million deaths per year. Leading risk factors accounting for 80% of these deaths are actually preventable, and there are 4 of them: tobacco, inactivity, unhealthy diets, harmful use of alcohol. And inactivity and unhealthy diets, as I said, are linked to this energy equation that then also has implications for our environment and for climate change. So in 1985, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, in the US, began collecting data in states. They would do surveys of the adult population, and they would actually ask people all sorts of questions about their health. But 2 of the questions included questions about heights and weights. And they would use those weight and height questions to calculate something called the body mass index. A body mass index of 30 or above is considered obese in adults. And so basically you could see, but this is by self-report, meaning that this is actually an underrepresentation of the problem in the United States. Because when people self-report their weights and heights, 2 things happen, studies have shown. Women underreport their weights, and men overreport their heights. And so the ratio of weights to heights is actually lower than what we see. But anyways, it gives us a sense of where the problem's at. So in 1985, when data first began collected by the US CDC, there was no state you could see above 14% obesity. And that stays through until 1990. But after 1990, you're going to see things change very, very quickly. Right? By 1997, the majority of the country is above 15%, and several states over 20%, and it just doesn't stop. I'm just going to click through. So by 2010, basically, there is no state below 20% obesity rates in adults. And remember, this is an underrepresentation of the problem, and multiple states above 30% obesity. And trending along with that is type 2 diabetes, right? Because type 2 diabetes, when I was going to medical school, one of the things I remember sitting in endocrinology class and the professor saying, type 2 diabetes, that's called adult onset diabetes because you rarely saw it in people under the age of 50, 50, right? And today we're seeing it in young adults, in teenagers, even in young children. And at these younger ages, it's related and highly associated with being obese. So essentially a very preventable condition, and many implications really, not only for our healthcare system, but for all sorts of quality of life issues and also economic issues in our communities. So the key issue with diabetes are the complications that develop, right? And so previously, when people were being diagnosed at age 60 or 70, they were developing their complications later in life, in their 70s and 80s, right? The complications include blindness. It's the leading cause of blindness in Canada. Kidney failure. It's a leading cause of kidney failure needing dialysis or kidney transplants. Limb amputations, because it affects the nerves and vessels in the limbs, and heart disease and strokes. So, if we were seeing previously people developing these complications in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, what are we going to see as children and teenagers and young adults develop these diseases? They're going to be developing their complications at the prime of life, in young adulthood, in middle adulthood, when they are still working. And so what are the implications in terms of a workforce, in terms of quality of life, of course also healthcare expenditure, in terms of maintaining life and health for these folks for many decades. The obesity trends amongst Canadian adults, not so different. You could see that there's now no province in Canada with obesity rates under 20%, and even the ones at 20% under 25% are disappearing, and increasingly we're seeing provinces and territories above 30% and even 35%. And the situation actually has been even worse in children. In the U.S., obesity has more than doubled in children and quadrupled in adolescents in the past 30 years. So today, over a third of children and adolescents are overweight or obese. In Canada, that's a similar situation. Over 30% of Canadian children overweight or obese. And as I said, if you talk to pediatricians today, they are routinely treating children and teenagers with high cholesterol medications, with antihypertensive medications. These were things, of course, that were unheard of just a couple of decades ago, except in middle and older ages. So New York City, going back to New York City, because of course we're going to share some of the things that have been done as strategies to address these issues. It's now faced with a population where about 60% of adults and 40% of children are overweight or obese. So the situation in our children in New York is actually worse than in the rest of the US and in Canada. Our situation in adults in New York City is actually a little bit better. In the rest of the US, nearly 70% of adults are overweight or obese. And if these trends continue in the US, projected trends show that 86% of U.S. adults will become overweight or obese by 2030. And the costs, according to the CDC, they're about $150 billion today. But by 2030, if we have 86% of adults overweight or obese, we're going to be looking at about $1 trillion in healthcare costs due to obesity alone and its complications. And we're not talking about even including things like sickness absence costs in this number. So huge, huge economic issues. In fact, the economic issues are so concerning that the UN recently held a summit focused on these diseases because of the concerns that as these diseases rise in low and middle income countries, that it's going to potentially bankrupt these countries because of the healthcare costs associated with treating these diseases. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention is, very frequently I think there's a lot of discussion about, is it our genetics, is it our environment that is responsible for the epidemics that we see? Well, because of how quickly the epidemics have changed and have risen, as you've seen, it is unlikely that our genes have changed within that short period of time, right? It's one generation that we're seeing this. And so if you look around, though, at our environment, it certainly has changed. Unhealthy, high-caloric foods are everywhere, right? Like before, when you went to a newsstand, you could basically buy newspapers and magazines. And today, you can buy soda pops and chips and, all sorts of things. In fact, those things seem to even outnumber the newspapers and magazines sometimes. If you look at new communities that are being designed, less and less of them are actually walkable communities. So many of them, many of our cities from urban sprawl. In many cities in the United States, for example, there's not even sidewalks on those streets that are sprawled. When we come into our buildings now, the usual method is to go up an escalator or an elevator. All of that takes electricity, of course, instead of our own physical energy. And the stairwell, if you can find it, might be relegated to some dark corner, perhaps locked, And even if you could open the door, maybe you don't want to use it because no one's there. It's in some corner of the building that no one can find. So anyways, our environments have certainly changed, and we've inadvertently basically designed activity out of our lives. Sometimes we've designed healthy food out of our neighborhoods. So there are many, for example, food desert neighborhoods in some of our low-income neighborhoods, even some of our suburban communities. And then there are also, of course, unhealthy, high-caloric foods and beverages are everywhere, and so we're constantly exposed. So at the same time that all of this is happening, of course, research has also been happening, and an evidence base has been building for the last few decades about the importance of building street and neighborhood design in being able to actually shape these behaviors and help support people in the behavior changes that we know they want to make. And why do we know that they want to make them? I mean, if you look at New Year's resolutions, right, every year, what are the top things that people want to do? They want to quit smoking, they want to drink less, they want to exercise more, eat better, lose weight. And yet, by the end of January, most of them have thrown up their arms in despair, right? Because the environments that we live in make it so difficult to do that. And so, a really key part of actually addressing the epidemics of today, even though these are behavioral choices, is to help people achieve the behavioral choices that we know they're trying to make and that they want to make. Akin to this is, for example, for infectious diseases, we also teach people to wash their hands, right, and to practice good sanitation. But what do? We equip every building, right, with sanitation measures, right, with clean water, with drinking water. And so akin to that, that's what we must do for the epidemics of today, is people have a role to play in their behavior changes, but as they try to undertake the behavior changes, we must also make an environment, our buildings, our streets, our neighborhoods, supportive of those behavior changes that they want to make. So examples of the types of things we can do that actually have a good evidence base. Designing our public realm and our streets and our neighborhoods to be conducive to walking and cycling and transit orientation. And when we do such things, studies show we could increase physical activity from between 35 and 160% in regular life. So what does that mean? That means actually having enough density to support different types of uses in an area. Different types of uses are, you live close to where you work. You live close to where you go to school, so you can actually walk to school or bicycle to school. There's actually amenities that support you in that connection, right? There's sidewalks, there's safe bicycle paths. If you want to walk in the evening once it gets dark in the winter, you could actually do so because the sidewalks have been cleared. The lighting is sufficient that you feel safe. Aesthetic elements like greenery and landscaping are important. Street art, for example, can be important. So having connections close to where you live and where you work and connected by bike paths and sidewalks are actually really important. During leisure time, we know people are also spending time doing recreational things. And studies show that if they have access to parks, playgrounds, and active recreation areas near where they live or work, they're more likely to spend their leisure time also doing some exercise. And also within our buildings, certain things that you can do to actually promote stair use and decrease elevator and escalator use amongst those who can use stairs. So simple point of decision signage. So if you place signs at elevator call areas next to escalators and outside of stairwells, encouraging people to take the stairs for health or other benefits, they're 50% more likely to do so, right? And so these simple, inexpensive measures, if you're actually doing them across many, many buildings, can actually start to have a population impact. Design matters, right? Aesthetic interventions like music and art in stairwells, having natural lighting, actually can increase stair use. If you could actually find the stairs when you walk in the door, so they're right there, they're visible, they're convenient, they're accessible, that makes a difference. And for high-rise buildings, we know that people won't walk like 30, 40 stories necessarily, but they may walk a few. And so one of the strategies that's been used in certain buildings, for example, there's a Caltrans building in California, the Cooper Union building in New York, they actually use something called skip-stop elevators. So these are elevators that don't stop at every floor. They actually stop at every third or fourth floor. And people in between those floors actually traverse the building by walking the stairs, right? There's, of course, one ADA elevator for people with disabilities and people who are carrying big items who need it. So 3,300% increase in stair use when you use a skip-stop elevator. And then, of course, also the issue of addressing healthy versus unhealthy food access within communities. So studies showing that if you have access to places that sell healthy food, like supermarkets, it's associated with healthier diets and lower weights. Conversely, if there's high density of unhealthy food outlets, like fast food, it increases weight and it increases unhealthy eating in both children and adults. Community gardening and urban agriculture. Studies show people who are exposed to community gardening, whether it's children or adults, are more likely to eat fruits and vegetables. And even access to tap water versus caloric beverages, right? It's a big source of calories in the North American diet. And when you drink your calories, you actually don't feel full because the process of actually chewing your food and eating helps to satiate the body. And so drinking your calories, that's why you could drink like big gulp, like 1,000 calories worth, and still be able to eat lots of things, right, in addition to that. And there are some studies showing that, for example, in this German study in high-needs neighborhoods, they actually took certain schools and made sure the water fountain was working, brought some education about tap water in, and they compared it to schools where they did nothing. And after a few years, those schools that had water fountain installation and some tap water education, the children had lower obesity rates compared to the other schools. So if we're going to be doing things to integrate health into the design of our building, streets, and neighborhoods, health can't be working alone doing this, right? Because health doesn't design our buildings, streets, or neighborhoods. But health, of course, can be aware of the studies. They can share this data with partners outside of health. And so there's really a strong need for partnerships across sectors, government sector and private sector, but also between disciplines, right? Health, architecture, urban design, urban planning, transport engineering, transportation planning, parks and recreation, even buildings, if building codes are important. And they're at times important. Finding synergies and co-benefits. So there are multiple benefits beyond health. I'm going to share that with you in the next few slides. And there's really important complementary roles, as I was saying. One of the key reasons that New York was so successful, I think it has been so successful in addressing some of these issues, has been that the different sectors have come together to work on these issues. And so when you have different sectors working together who know their sector, they can come up with ideas of what might be feasible in that local context in their own sector. And that's what we've seen happen. The different departments and the different disciplines have really taken a key role in helping to identify potential solutions in the design and construction of buildings, streets, and neighborhoods. And as a result, policy ideas, practice ideas come to play. And researchers, of course, have played a really key role as well in evidence reviews and synthesis and evaluation. And, another, I think, key thing has been having forums of dialogue where different sectors can come together and have discussion and share ideas and find solutions together. And so we now have an annual Fit City conference that's being replicated in multiple cities globally. The most recent one, actually, was in Sao Paulo. Several Canadian cities have had similar conferences, U.S. cities as well, and also London, England. So these are the Fit City conferences. New York has had 8 of them now. It's typically in May of each year. It has basically a public sector panel where the heads of different agencies report back on the progress that's being made on these issues. It has a private sector panel where, innovative and developers and architecture firms and urban planning firms are able to share their projects to promote best practices. And we also have a community sector panel where advocacy groups and community residents and community groups that have been involved in this work can share some of their projects and work and share with others how it can be done. So as I said, this has been this idea of a conference that allows for intersectoral collaboration and dialogue has been occurring across communities in the U.S. and increasingly also in other parts of the world. This is a list of 15 U.S. cities that actually worked in a peer-to-peer mentoring partnership that New York City was given funds by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control in leading. And so you could see multiple communities. So it's not just New York City and the really urban areas like New York and Chicago, but even a tribal nation like Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. Of course, the strategies are slightly different, right, depending on context. But there's something that every community can do. So in Cherokee Nation, for example, they use their school as the hub for looking at walkability issues around the school, as a hub for potential recreation opportunities for the community. San Diego, which is actually a county, San Diego County, it doesn't only have San Diego City, but actually multiple municipalities, some of which are actually very rural. And so one of the key things that San Diego County worked on was a metropolitan transportation plan across the different municipalities. In Canadian cities as well, this has been going on. And Montreal is a part of this grant called Healthy Canada by Design, which is a grant from Health Canada that has gone to the Heart and Stroke Foundation. The Heart and Stroke Foundation is now working with cities and regional health departments across 8 of the 10 provinces. And I know that Alberta, since this began, they're not a part of this Healthy Canada by Design, but Alberta, I'm also working with Alberta now on a similar initiative, led by the Office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health. So, it's occurring in Australian cities. Livable neighborhood guidelines that integrate health and environmental issues are increasingly being used in different Australian states, from the East Coast to the West Coast. This is a city, an area in Korea, and you could see that, they've retrofitted this area, right? Changing this highway that used to basically cover a river and re-exposing the river and basically, creating amenities for all modes, pedestrians, cyclists, as well as some lanes for the car. So some examples of what's been done, for example, in New York City has been taking the evidence base that I was talking about in health and actually putting it into a publication that designers and planners and folks in the built environment world could use. And so it was co-led by 4 city agencies, Health, Transportation, City Planning, our Public Works Agency, with the participation of 8 other agencies giving input and writing sections. It's got basically the elements that I've talked about, right? Thinking about the history and how we can learn from the past, the important elements of creating great urban design, of building design opportunities, and also synergies with sustainable design and with universal accessibility. Urban design strategies, we've talked about, land use mix, sufficient density to support that, access to supermarkets, farmers markets, drinking water as a part of that land use mix, also recreational areas like parks, play areas, and also pedestrianized areas like pedestrian plazas, transit access, pedestrian-friendly environments, and bicycle networks and infrastructure, complementary building design strategies. So if you're going to promote biking, when people get to work, they have to have a place to store it, right? So bicycle storage, and Sky will talk about some of the policies that have occurred in New York, thinking about recreation spaces for children and adults, particularly in multi-residential buildings. We've talked about stairs, and then also accessibility, things like drinking water in worksite buildings. And then synergies, right? When we create better designs for health and these health issues, we're actually also creating more accessible places for different people. We know that many of our cities are aging, right? And if people are to age in place, when they stop driving, they have to be able to access their neighbors, services, things like food, by being able to not have to drive there. So accessibility and these health issues and the designs for them actually overlap tremendously. Even making elevators less crowded and more available for people who actually need them. So our Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities have told us that very crowded elevators, not useful for people who are in wheelchairs or have walkers, very difficult to maneuver. And so if we can get more healthy people and people who are able-bodied to use the stairs, that actually has the synergy of making elevators more available and accessible. Improving the environment. So we often think about bicycling and walking versus the car as an environmental measure. But Escalators and elevators use electricity. In fact, I read a statistic that said, an escalator running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week can generate as much as 4 carloads of carbon dioxide per year. So not insignificant if we keep mindlessly putting them into our buildings. Active recreation rather than television, similar sort of thing. Like in New York State, TVs are anticipated to very soon overtake refrigerators as the main source of household appliance energy use. Right? So those big plasma screen TVs that are on in every room in many, many houses is now actually eating up more electricity and energy than things like refrigerators. We often talk about tap water versus bottled water, but all those soda pops and sugar-sweetened beverages, they come in cans and they come in bottles, and they're going into the landfill, and they have huge transportation miles. And if you think about fresh, healthy food, right, they usually generate very little waste, and the waste that's there is compostable. But think of all of those highly processed foods out there, whether it's from a fast food restaurant or from the grocery store. They're highly packaged, they're highly processed, they have huge transportation miles. For those who might be architects and green building professionals, we've also synergized with environmental issues by actually making available now, creating and then making available a LEED pilot credit called Design for Active Occupants. So now, if you address active recreation issues and active vertical circulation issues, you can get an extra point now from the USGBC. And this point has been used in over 30 US buildings currently of all sorts. And then other benefits are more and more studies showing that children's fitness associated with higher academic achievement. Even costs, right? So one of the questions that often comes up is, can we afford to build in this way? And I think the answer is, can we afford to not build in this way? Because more and more studies are showing that, in fact, infrastructure cost savings can be achieved with more compact, walkable development patterns compared to sprawled patterns. Households and social equity issues, right? If you live in a transit-rich, walkable neighborhood, you'll spend 9% of your monthly income, compared to 25% of your monthly income on transportation if you live in car-only types of neighborhoods. And then even the creation of jobs. This study showing that when you create roads that have complete streets infrastructure with bicycling, with pedestrian amenities, you create more jobs for every dollar that you spend on that road. And that's because land costs associated with more compact development patterns are lower, but labor costs on any given mile of road is higher. And people want this. Recent real estate polls from the US to Canada to Australia are showing that the majority of people now want to live in neighborhoods where they have the option to walk and take transit. Example in Edmonton. And then there are multiple supplement documents as well, in addition to the active design guidelines, some of which Sky will talk about. So I'm going to pass this over to Sky. Thanks.